So good to see everyone. And I am very happy to introduce our speaker. I just muted everyone. David, you can unmute. Everybody else should stay muted. And here's the introduction. David Kuney is the author of On Rockingham Street, Reclaiming My Family's Jewish Identity, Our Journey from Vilna to the Suburban South. David is an adjunct professor of bankruptcy law at the Georgetown University of Law Center. He practiced law for over 46 years and was a partner at Sidley and Austin. This is a good resume. Not that this morning is not a good resume builder, but wow. For the past 12 years, David has been actively involved in Jewish adult education and literacy. David has served on the board of directors for the Pardes Institute, love Pardes, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and Adat Shalom Congregation in Bethesda, Maryland, where he chaired the Adult Education Committee. Not an easy task, that's all I'm saying. He studied in Jerusalem at the Pardes Institute, and he served as the chairperson and organizer of a full-day program at the Georgetown University Law Center entitled The Moral Economy, which involved both academic and rabbinic professionals in discussions to the intersection of Jewish law and American civil law. And if you can handle both academics and rabbis, then you are totally, completely good to go. So with no further ado, David.
All right. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for that nice introduction. And good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. I'm sorry we can't be together in person. I'm going to share a screen. I've got a presentation that I've put together that I hope you'll enjoy. And let me just make sure. Vanessa, is this showing up okay?
Yep, I can see it. Looks great.
All right, great. So
if I can't see something, I'll be the first to speak up.
All right. And since I'm doing this from a visiting home, if I have a little technical issue, bear with me, but I think we've got everything figured out. So I want to begin with a bit of an overview so you kind of know where I'm headed. My book's title, which I don't think you can see all of, is about a journey from Vilna to the suburban South and about efforts to do what I call reclaim Jewish identity. So the hint in the book title is that something might have been lost in that journey from the old country to the new world. And I've come to think that maybe what was lost was part of our Jewish identity, and maybe in part accounts for the documented fall off in Jewish observance and Jewish literacy. So because of that, I've entitled my talk, Is American Jewry Hanging by a Thread? And I think it's kind of an edgy title, but it reflects my belief that one of the most consequential issues facing Judaism today is really assimilation, continuity, and maybe even survival. It's a very timely issue, not even including what's going on in Ukraine. And I want to look at 3 recent publications so you can see how my book kind of fits into, until about a month ago, what were probably the most pressing issues. So the first thing that happened was that the Pew report on American Jewry came out in May 2021. Actually, it was just a few days before my book was published. I thought maybe they knew I was coming out and they wanted to beat me to it. The Pew report collected a lot of disturbing data about the state of American Jewry. And later in my talk, I'm going to go over some of it in more detail. But here's the key thing. They announced that about a quarter of US Jews really don't identify with the Jewish religion, and they consider themselves to be, in a phrase they coined, nothing in particular Jews. And the report found that many American Jews are not even concerned with whether their grandchildren are Jewish. In fact, when the Jerusalem Post read the Pew report, they published an article that said, and I quote, "We are coming apart at the seams." So I thought this phrase, nothing in particular Jews, might even be a subtitle for our talk today. The other work is Dara Horn's book, which has gotten a lot of press, called People Love Dead Jews. Now the opening line in her book is this: people love dead Jews, Living Jews, not so much. Her leading example is that of a worker at the Anne Frank exhibit in Amsterdam who was asked not to wear a yarmulke because it might make the visitors feel uncomfortable, as if the Holocaust wouldn't make them feel uncomfortable. Dara's premise is that the effect of widespread assimilation is what she called erasing our Judaism. She claims we don't even notice the effect of assimilation anymore, and they're actually embarrassed to be Jewish. There's a third work that I thought bears on what we're talking about today. And that's a book by Clint Smith called How the Word is Passed. Clint wrote that we are formed by the visual images that surround us in daily life. This, of course, cuts to where I'm going to be going in my talk. His formation was that we're deeply affected, or he was deeply affected by what he called the iconography of the South. And he grew up surrounded by the statues of Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart. And he learned this lesson: we believe what we see. And I think Clint Smith's book was true for those of us Jews who grew up in the South in the 50s and the 60s. The images we saw all around us were Christian and Southern, but they were rarely Jewish. There were few Jewish symbols in our schools and nothing in daily life to remind us about our Judaism. No Ben Gurion Airport, no streets named after Jewish heroes. Well, when I started giving this talk, I noticed people would say to me, but doesn't everybody have the same problem? Aren't all religions going through a fall off? In fact, there was a new comment in the New Yorker a few weeks ago that I thought summarized this problem. He said, in America, more people believe in it, space aliens, 65%, than believe in the biblical God. I thought that was shocking. And a friend of mine told me a few days ago, it looks like the golden age of American Judaism is over. I wonder if we actually had a golden age. On Rockingham Street, really by accident, tries to tie together what has become this very popular discussion that we're having. All of these works, mine included, are really asking this question: why did things turn out like this? What did we or our grandparents do to make the Pew Report our reality? So Rockingham Street, my book, I'm hoping makes a contribution to these issues. It is really not enough just to read the Pew Report to tell us today how many Jews believe and how many don't, nor Dara Horn to tell us how non-Jews feel about us. What I think we need to do is look for the root causes. How did we get here? And then tease out the issues that matter: assimilation versus literacy or something else. But to tell you the truth, Rockingham Street was never intended to be a treatise on Jewish education. What I started out to do was to write a story about two people, my maternal grandparents, paternal, called Saul and Anna Kuney, who in 1913 made the journey from Vilna to Chicago and later to the suburban South. Here's a picture of them in the 1950s, almost 50 years after they had arrived in America. I think they look pretty assimilated. My book was meant to be a story, starting with their journey and then their attempt later, and my father's attempt, to reclaim Jewish identity, and then to ask, and I want to ask throughout, is reclamation even possible? So it was meant to honor their memory. And I thought by looking at the life of Saul and Anna, and then my parents, Esther and Joe, I began to understand that what happened over 100 years ago in Eastern Europe may be responsible for the life we're leading today. That maybe in the life of Saul and Anna is the root causes of how we lead our Jewish life today. So in doing my book, and doing my research and looking at the files, I came to the conclusion that the narrative that we live by is really not Fiddler on the Roof. I think Rockingham Street challenges the notion that Fiddler is a narrative that explains our Jewish experience. I came to the opposite conclusion. I don't think our narrative is Fiddler on the Roof. And I don't think while Tevi was hanging on the tradition that Saul was trying to do that. I think our narrative is a Hamilton narrative. I think Saul was determined when he came to his city, Chicago, to be secular and rational and not to be an observant Jew. I think Saul and his friends and his colleagues were the ambitious immigrants who realized that in New York or Chicago, you really can be a new man. I think Saul might have agreed it was wise to talk less and smile more. I think Saul might have agreed with Darrell Horn that he actually wanted to erase his life in the old country. That's why my prologue in the book is entitled The Sacred Act of Remembering, but the first chapter is called On Forgetting. So Saul's narrative that I want to share with you really venerates the birth of America as a true second creation story for the birth of the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. In my narrative, the colonial South plays a starring role. The Southern narrative is one in rich iconography, but barren of the Jewish story. In America, it still is easy to be a nothing in particular Jew. But it was a story I wanted to tell. At least that's what I thought when I started to write this. And Saul and Anna's story began in Vilna in the late 1800s. Vilna was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, and Napoleon, in fact, called it the Jerusalem of the North. Vilna was the home of the Vilna Gaon, one of the greatest Talmudic commentators. The picture on the slide is what was called the Great Synagogue, built in 1630. The Jewish synagogue was the dominant icon of Vilna. In Vilna, everywhere you looked was Judaism. Orthodox Judaism was a part of daily life. Shabbat could be felt in the quiet streets on sundown, on Friday afternoons. Judaism was palpable. The notion of the Torah was a living presence. But there was another side to Vilna. And this was the surprise to me and what I discovered. Well, I didn't realize that Vilna was also the home of a radical movement called the Haskalah, a movement that many of you may be familiar with, that really began earlier and was really a turning away from observant Judaism and a stress on secular and rational life. The movement had really begun in the 1770s, before Saul and Anna were born, of course. But I think we can understand the Enlightenment and how it affected Saul and Anna and how it affected their children and now me, their grandchildren. If you look at the writings of Chaim Grod, you come to understand what the Enlightenment meant, both in Eastern Europe and in Vilna. I don't know if you know who Chaim Grod is, but he was described by Elie Wiesel as the greatest living Yiddish writer. He was sometimes called the Faulkner of Yiddish literature, and Ruth Weiss teaches a course at Harvard entirely devoted to his writings, and yet I still think very few of us really know him. In the opening lines of his novel called The Yeshiva, I think he tells us what we need to know about the Enlightenment. He describes a young Torah student who was racked with doubts about the existence of God. The Torah student was grappling with the fundamental principles. He knew that there was a Torah, and he knew that without Torah, he couldn't find his way, but he'd stopped believing that Torah was divinely given. And he wasn't even sure about the first principles of Maimonides. Maimonides wrote the first principle of Judaism is the belief in the existence of the Creator. And yet, it was exactly this first principle that rabbis and ordinary tailors like Saul were turning away from. So what's critical, and what I discovered, is that this turn away from observance Judaism, when Saul and Anna were still in Vilna, wasn't a minor scuffle. This was a paradigm shift. Grod's wife later would write that her husband was really simply trying to show the tension between what she called the sacred and the profane. But I now believe this tension between the sacred and the profane was really never resolved. In fact, it's what we see today. I think it's part of the cause of assimilation. I think it's what began over 100 years ago. I think it began the moment Moses came down from Sinai, to tell you the truth. I know that Saul was in direct contact with the secular movement because I discovered the ship manifest from 1913 that was completed at the port of embarkation when he came over from Vilna. This manifest that you see on the screen was actually required by US law that had the columns that you had to fill out. The ship manifest was required to say where the immigrant was going to go to live. And the manifest for Saul said he was going to live with Abraham God. And the remarkable thing, the ship manifest also said that Abraham was Saul's cousin, because Abraham turned out to be the brother of Chaim God. They were half brothers because they had different mothers. But the father of both Abraham and Chaim was the leading rabbi, radical rabbi, who was really turning against observant Judaism. So in a word, the Grade family, or the Grod family, my family, was really at the epicenter of this turn away from observant Judaism. And then when Saul arrived in America, he actually moved in and lived with the Grods for 3 years. So I believe that Abraham, Chaim, and Saul shared these deep doubts about Judaism and their fundamental belief in God. So the ship's manifest was a clue to me that Saul was going to America with his desire to turn towards secularism and rational thought, and that he was more than willing to turn his back on most of observant Judaism, at least when he arrived, and before things were to turn later on. Saul boarded the SS Montrose in the summer of 1913, and he headed to Quebec. From there, he went to his new home in Chicago to live with Abraham Grod. Saul left for many reasons. I think you probably heard them: the draft, the pogroms, the burden of observant Judaism. His wife Anna didn't go with him because her father had been sent to Siberia, and she insisted that she was going to go east and try to find him. Anna, in fact, was far more religious than Saul, and she was determined to find her father. I don't know that she ever did. But when I saw Saul in my mind's eye on the SS Montrose, he didn't leave me a diary. I had to kind of create it. I began to see him walking on the deck without his wife and wondering if she would ever join him. I saw him checking his small suitcase that I'm sure he brought with him. And there he saw his thimble and his thread. He was a great tailor. These were the humble tools that he was hoping would give him a life in the new world. But Saul was done with the old world. He had left his prayer book behind. His daily davening was done for now. I think Saul left his observant Judaism in the Atlantic Ocean on the way from Vilna. Here's one thing I need to stress. Saul's story was not unique. Saul was not the only Jewish tailor on the Montrose that day, filled with doubts about his Judaism. Respected Jewish writers have noted that many of the Jews who came over at that time were going through the exact same process. And Barry Schrag, who's a well-known scholar, said, serious Jewish learning, Jewish literacy, became marginal goals for the American Jews. And he wrote that as a result, in his mind, being Jewish lost its meaning for American Jews. This notion that there's a direct link between Jewish literacy and Jewish meaning, I think, are at the heart of what we might learn from Saul's journey to the suburban South. Maybe it's the absence of Jewish literacy that may be at the core issue of our modern problem. But this much I'm reasonably sure of. Saul's story is the same story for many of our grandparents. Saul's story, maybe your grandparents as well, is really what laid the foundation for the Pew Report. Saul and Anna lived in Chicago for 36 years. Here's in fact where they actually lived. Maybe you know this address, 2951 Broadway. That's where his tailor shop was. That's where his home were. They were great tailors. I know because they mended all my clothes. Saul did well in business. Everybody liked him. But his Jewish life was sparse. In my memoir, the opening chapter, we meet Saul in 1930 when he's actually walking down Broadway. The same year when his son, Joe, my father, was supposed to be having his bar mitzvah. But Joe almost didn't have a bar mitzvah. Saul actually refused to pay the tuition, and Joseph was kicked out of Hebrew school. I know the story from a little scrap of paper that my father prepared and left in his files that I found after he passed away. Anna barely saved the bar mitzvah by paying the cost she had saved through putting some money aside. So when we first see Saul on Broadway, 1930, he's taking a break from his work and he's gone off to buy some deep fried shrimp from the Dime Pier, which is actually near Lake Michigan. I remember the smell. Anna's actually home getting ready for Shabbat dinner. And Saul is trying to keep the grease from the brown bag from soiling his suit. What he's really trying to do is hide from Anna his disinterest in keeping kosher. So now, by the 1930s, the thoughts of Jerusalem of Lithuania have mostly been laid aside and forgotten by Saul. The pattern of laying aside Jewish observance and moving away from Jewish texts continued on to the next generation. Saul and Anna's first son, Joseph, my father, shown on the right, was born in 1917. He's standing next to Saul, and Anna, of course, is seated. The handsome man in the Navy uniform is my Uncle Julius. Joe married Esther in 1939, and sort of an interesting story. They were born one day apart in the Cook County Hospital. I think when the babies cried, they could hear each other. Esther was a granddaughter of a Cohen, but they were really not of the priestly class. My mother's family was also non-observant, and her family would later move to California, and some of them actually became Christian. Their Jewish life in Chicago was sparse at best. They're not married in a synagogue, although a rabbi does officiate, and they did have a marriage contract, the ketubah. Their first son, Richard, is shown in the picture, but I found his baby book, and it's from a Christian publisher. There's no record of a Jewish bris. I'm sure there was a circumcision. No record that Esther and Joe attended or joined a synagogue. No Jewish books, no mementos of Jewish culture. I don't think they kept Shabbat. I know they never kept kosher. So later in life, when we had a meal in Arlington, milk and meat were saved and together. I grew up not knowing that observant Jews don't eat cheeseburgers. In 1947, my father got a job at the American Chemical Society, which had its headquarters in Washington. So they moved to a small neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia called Gleewood at the intersection of Glebe Road and Lee Highway. At that time, there was not a synagogue in Arlington. From our kitchen window, you could see the old Glebe Theater. The movie that's being shown is God Is My Co-Pilot, actually released shortly before they got there. I don't think that was a Jewish God. I always wondered why my parents, Esther and Joe, came to Washington. Why didn't they move to the suburbs of Silver Spring and Montgomery County, where all the Jews were? I don't think my father asked, where's the Jewish community? I think he asked, where's the closest bus line to DC? I think my father was like Saul. His focus was on his work. So they chose Arlington, where I would later grow up. No established synagogue, and the only tiny Jewish congregation met literally in a shoe store in Clarendon, Virginia. So it became clear to me that when Esther and Joe came to Washington, they were doing exactly what Saul had taught them to do. They were leaving behind most of their Jewishness. By the way, a friend gave me a picture of, well, I'll come to that in a minute. Here's the house that we lived in when we moved from Gleewood. Esther and Joe moved to Rockingham Street. I named the book after the street because I believe that geography is destiny. I believe that iconography does matter. I think we do tend to believe what we see. And what we saw was a Christian world and a Southern world. Rockingham Street was only a block away from Lee Highway. You remember that Lee, Robert E. Lee, the greatest trader of American history. And yet if you grew up in the suburban South where I did, everywhere you looked, everything was named after them. Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee. No one was embarrassed by the Southern flag. So the South, even that part of Northern Virginia, accelerated our assimilation because of the powerful and seductive iconography. All of it was wrong, but all of it was constantly around us. And although Northern Virginia today is profoundly different, not so when I grew up. It was holding on to its Southern heritage with all of its might. None of the schools that I went to were integrated until 1959. and only then with the help of the police. Well, after I gave this talk once, a friend of mine said, you should see what your house looks like today. So it doesn't really fit into Jewish survival, but I thought it was interesting. So another aspect about how we grew up in the South in the 50s and the 60s. Dwight Eisenhower was president in 1950. Boy, wouldn't it be a blessing to have him back? Eisenhower, well, maybe. Eisenhower was known as the cornflakes president. This is because the advertising industry had helped elect him. But I thought there was another reason. I thought because our cultural history was bland and tasteless. When I grew up, there was no revolution. Democrats and Republicans spoke to one another. We never got involved in politics. There were no Beatles. Elvis Presley hadn't appeared until I got into 6th grade. I Love Lucy and Arthur Godfrey were the two most popular shows on TV. The book Peyton Place was considered far too racy to be permitted to be read. I think the same could be said of our Jewishness that I experienced in the suburban South. I think it was soggy and tasteless. I think our lackluster Judaism fit into the culture perfectly. I was essentially an illiterate Jew. So were my parents and contemporaries. And this was how Jewish life was led in the 1950s. So what I saw was a consequence of an entire generation of Jews who wanted to forget observant Judaism, and for whom Jewish learning, what in fact you're doing today, was really not a key part of their life. What I was seeing in the suburban South is a direct result of what Saul and Anna brought with them from Vilna as part of the Jewish Enlightenment. But I saw something else that reminded me about how small Judaism was compared to Christianity. If Vilna was the Jerusalem of Lithuania, I asked myself, well, what should we call Arlington? And I thought it was really the Catholic Empire, impressive and omnipotent, a place with beautiful churches and expensive parochial schools. Everywhere I looked, I saw the majestic iconography of Christianity. I was overwhelmed with the sense of the large, omnipotent religion, with its violent icons, virgin births, and crucifixions. They were startling and riveting. We Jews, we were outgunned. Our Judaism seemed so small by way of comparison. The only place we could pray was in a shoe store where you could either pray or buy a pair of Buster Brown shoes. But I also noted this, the Catholics were providing their children with intensive education and sending their school to parochial schools, which when I grew up in Arlington, we never even mentioned. So early in Arlington, we did what all Jews did. We copied our Christian neighbors. Dara Horn was right, you know. We did want to look like our Christian neighbors. And here's the proof. Here's the photo to prove it. If you can't fight them, join them. The battle cry of the assimilated. Here in Arlington, we celebrated Christmas with our neighbors. We had a Christmas tree. And we told Santa Claus we had been good and what toys we yearned for. In John Marshall Elementary School, I said the Lord's Prayer each day. I think I was praying to Jesus, Matthew chapter 9, verse something. In the 1950s, we wanted to be cowboys, Dale Evans and Roy Rogers. We'd never heard of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let alone Moses. Friday night was football night at the local high school. We didn't light candles on Friday night. Saturday morning was a work day. We cut the grass, we ran errands. I don't recall a single time when around our dinner table, we talked about the weekly Torah portion. And then this. When we celebrated our holidays, they were less than full-hearted. And to capture this, I titled a section of my book, Passover at Sears. I think the title of the section gives away what I was trying to say. The notion that we were not supposed to eat bread, that we were supposed to pay attention to the minutiae of the holiday, really gave way to the need to shop, to go to Sears, to go wherever. And during Passover, we would stop at the lunch counter in the basement, and we'd have a Hires root beer and a Briggs hot dog on a bun, not on matzah. I didn't really understand what it meant to be Jewish. I didn't understand what it meant to be meticulous in the Jewish holidays. We had lost our sense of that. We weren't alone. We were the children and the grandchildren of the European Enlightenment. The sacred and the profane in our life were still at war with one another. Well, despite the seeming indifference, the Jewish observance, there came a time when there was an effort to reclaim our Jewish identity. Whether that reclamation worked is still an open question that we can talk about later. But in 1953, Saul and Anna moved to Arlington. I don't know for sure why they did this, but they moved to live a block away from us. Here's what happened though, right before they moved. And in my mind, I've always think this is what caused it. One day when we were still living in Gleewood, before they had moved, I came home from first grade with a copy of a color picture of Jesus. Anna had come down to visit us. I thought Jesus looked wonderful. And I told Anna how beautiful and impressed I was. Anna was horrified. She said, David, we're Jewish. We don't believe that Christ was our God. This was news to me. Who had I been praying to? Well, it was just a matter of months after Jesus' picture that Saul and Anna left Chicago and moved 2 blocks away from our house on Rockingham Street. And from that moment on, Saul and Anna were in our lives almost daily. They had a workroom as you entered through the back screen door of their very modest house. And I could always find them working on their 1930 black Singer sewing machine. As I said, they were wonderful tailors. They fixed everything that we could rip and tear. But Anna didn't move from Chicago to fix our clothes, or at least not that. I'd like to read you just a little bit of a passage from my book to give you a little bit of a feel for what I'm trying to explore and get to. I start 3rd grade in 1953. Saul and Anna moved around the corner from our new home on Rockingham Street to the land of the Broyhill Plantation. And aside, he was a big Republican developer. A land filled with car dealerships and temples from the Babbitts. Saul and Anna had never been inside a car dealership. They had never seen a suburb. I think now they might have come to save us. After all, we still had a Christmas tree that first year on Rockingham Street. Anna soon put an end to all of that. I think now that no small part of Anna's decision was coming to put an end to Christmas for the Kuneys. She had fought with Saul long enough over being observant, put up with his refusal to let her boys attend Hebrew school, and his seeming indifference to the bar mitzvahs. When she saw that we were ignoring our Judaism, that we were celebrating Christmas, saying prayers in a school that referred to our Savior, she may have insisted that she and Saul move to Arlington to do what could be done to save some small part of our Jewishness. She would bring 3 sets of dishes, even though I'm sure we never paid much attention to which were for milk and which for meat. Anna still lit Shabbat candles, covering her head with a napkin, hands over her eyes, saying the blessing in the language we did not understand. Eyes closed, her thoughts perhaps returned to Vilna, or to parents who'd long since vanished from her life, or to something else, the young man she loved for a short time in Siberia and then had to leave behind. I put that in the family myth is that when Anna went to Siberia to find her father, she fell in love with a young man and had a hard time leaving and wasn't sure she could ever come to America. Another factor in the reclamation was the coming of age of the Arlington Fairfax Jewish Center. In 1947, shortly after we had moved, ground was broken for what was then Arlington's first synagogue. It was initially the Arlington Jewish Center, but it later became the Arlington Fairfax Jewish Center. You can see the old name still on the brick wall in the front. It's now called Eitz Chaim, and for a long time it was the only conservative synagogue in Arlington, which when you think about it as being the suburbs of the nation's capital, it's kind of hard to believe. I'm told that another synagogue in Fairfax, Olin Tikva, is now the largest synagogue. But here's another amazing story. In 1952, the Arlington Fairfax Center hired Rabbi Noah Galinkin. He was also from Vilna, and Vilna to him reminded him of the Jerusalem of Lithuania, because to him, Jewish literacy was key. And oddly enough, Rabbi Golinkin knew well Chaim Grod. They were in fact Hevruta partners when they studied at the yeshiva together. So it would later turn out that both of these literary and sort of intellectual giants were not only friends in Vilna, but later would be the people that changed the cause and outcome of our own life. But Golinkin recognized that Jewish survival and literacy were inseparable. He was a fervent believer that reading Hebrew and Jewish text was really at the core of Jewish continuity and survival. But he discovered that the Jews of Arlington Fairfax were illiterate. They were like my parents. He knew that when Jews came to services, they were utterly lost as to what page he was reading from. He said he wanted his only goal to be that the congregation could, at least in his words, point with their finger to the place where he was saying the prayers. Pointing, nothing more, no grammar, no translation, just the barest minimum of ability to read the block Hebrew letters. I think Golinkin identified the core problem. I didn't know it when I was young. What he saw was larger than not just being able to read. He saw we didn't understand what was being said in our services. He knew we sat there in a state of silent confusion and loss of interest. We had given up on Hebrew. What he saw in short was that our community was deeply illiterate. And because we couldn't read our text, we couldn't understand what it meant to be Jewish. Little wonder we can't sit through a 3-hour service without wondering what we're going to be doing next. Little wonder the Pew Report says only 12% of Jews attend services regularly. Little wonder that synagogues are often losing members. But the real change in our reclamation, and it's funny how life works out, didn't begin with Torah, but began with my mother, Esther, who was a secretary. She learned shortly after she moved to Arlington that Rabbi Golinkin needed a secretary. And my mother, who never went to college, had studied shorthand and secretarial skills. And she was a very gifted secretary. I know I found all of her shorthand books years later. So she worked for Rabbi Golinkin and then later for Rabbi Bash for decades. So had my mother not been a great secretary, our efforts to reclaim our Jewish identity might never have occurred. Now, talk of managing the business of a synagogue dominated our family life. Our dinner conversation focused as much on Henry, the janitor, as on the rabbi. But at some point, there was no longer a line between our synagogue life and our private life. I wasn't really a conservative Jew. I began to think of myself as an administrative Jew. I knew where the mops and pans were kept. I just didn't know what the weekly Torah portion was. Well, things followed. I think my mother dragged my father to synagogue, and sooner or later, my father actually became the president of the synagogue. I think mostly because of my mother. So Joe had to sit on the bima every Saturday for years, I think at least 2 years on end. And then he began to attend the adult Jewish education classes taught on Sundays. And now for the first time in his life, Joe was beginning to learn the things he had never learned when he had been a younger man in Chicago. Somewhere, I think, all of this learning, all of this study, all this immersion in the text was starting to change Joe. My father, Joe, was a brilliant man. He graduated from the University of Chicago with a BS in chemistry. But I think he was the legacy of Saul, who had tossed his learning into the Atlantic Ocean that really shaped Joe's early life. So things got better in Arlington. There was a modest reclamation. But there are things we never learned, things that I never heard about until I became, frankly, in my 50s and 60s. There was something lacking in our twice-a-day Hebrew school. Look at this screen for a moment. I never actually really heard of Maimonides, Rashi, Heschel, Sternberg, Leibowitz, Solovetsky, Mordecai Kaplan. If you'd given me a pop quiz to tell whether these were baseball players or Jewish scholars, I would have had 0. That was our education growing up in Arlington. We didn't study Hebrew grammar. I never knew you could conjugate a Hebrew verb. It wasn't enough. You cannot find your way into Torah without a leader. So as I wrote this memoir and saw the modest reclamation of my father, I began to look back at our Jewish education, and I began to ask this: regardless of how observant we wish to be, can we maintain our historic role in world civilization if we don't have a deeper knowledge of our sacred text and the commentators to make them come alive for us? As I wrote my memoir, I began to ask this: maybe assimilation isn't the problem. Maybe it's Jewish literacy. And then I said, was I really just telling a story about Saul and Anna? Well, that brings me to today. All of this is history. All of my family's life is in a box somewhere in my basement. And now I have to ask, why did any of this matter? Has any of this really changed? What are the consequences of Saul and Anna's journey? What I saw, as I've been saying throughout, they've learned that one can be without much Jewish learning and not actually be sensitive to that. Here's a recent example. When we were recently visiting my son and daughter-in-law, when they then lived in Philadelphia, we were walking the street one night and we came to some friends who were having a Shabbat dinner. They actually came out to greet us and say hello on the sidewalk. They remarked that their daughter had just missed Passover because she had to attend a soccer match. And the mother said, you know, that was fine with her. And her exact words were, you know, first things first. So how could I object? We'd had our Passover at Sears. This brings me to the Pew Report. And here's the truth of the matter. If we examine the Pew Report, we're going to see that Judaism really isn't the first thing for most Jews. Among American Jews, according to the Pew Report, religious faith is the least common source of meaning for all things put on the survey. Only 1 in 5 Jews say they get a great deal of meaning and fulfillment from the Jewish religion. So then people who see these slides always say, yeah, but David, isn't that true of all the other religions as well? And here's the answer. 21% of Jews say that religion is important, but 41% of other faiths say religion is very important. That means twice as many people of the Christian faith find religion to be very important to their life as opposed to those of us who are Jewish. The legacy of Saul and Anna is alive and well. And here I think is the crushing blow of all, the one that kind of breaks my heart. The most disturbing report of the Pew Report comes from a new question that they never asked before. Do you care about passing along your Jewish identity? 34% of Jews only said it'd be very important for their grandchildren to be Jewish. Only 1/3 care about whether their grandchildren are Jewish. I think that suggests the single most important finding in the Pew Report, because here now we see the link, or the possible link, between assimilation and continuity. By the way, among the Orthodox, 91% want their grandchildren to be Jewish. The Pew Report is difficult to deal with. There's the intermarriage issue. It's almost too political to touch. Everybody has somebody in their family who's intermarried. I do too. The Pew Report found that of all Jews, 58% are now intermarried. But if you go back just 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, 61% of all Jews have a non-Jewish spouse. So during the past decade, 2 out of 3 Jews married non-Jews. And then the worst. Of those, only 28% are raising their children as Jewish. So the Jewish Enlightenment, for better or worse, never really did let go of us. So my wife has a lesson for me as I come to the close of my talk. She said to me, David, don't leave people on a down note. They won't like you. You have to find something optimistic. She said, you have to find something good to say, something positive. Let me find it here. I need to find this thing that I want to read to you. So there was something positive, and I've been searching to ask myself what you might. I framed the question this way: is the Pew Report where we want to end up? In my frame, are we not really still glued to the covenant? Are we really still not a people who share the highest ideals of human civilization? I think the answer is yes. I think Walensky proves that to us. Who could be a better example of heroism, of Jewish values, of everything in life that is sacred, of the beautiful joinder of the political and the sacred, of a man that could make us weep for joy. So I now see hope when I see that. I see hope when I try to understand how Joe struggled to reclaim his Jewish identity. So I left out the very ending of the story to right now. When Joe was 73, or was it 83, he celebrated his 70th anniversary of his bar mitzvah. And now for the first time in his life, Joe tried to learn how to read from the Torah. And I'd like to read to you how I describe that in my book. Despite or because of all these passages, Joe moves toward a more meaningful embrace of his Judaism. As Joe is nearing his 83rd birthday, he decides to follow the Jewish tradition of having a second bar mitzvah celebration on the 70th anniversary of his earlier bar mitzvah. But this time, Joe insists he will read in Hebrew from the Torah scroll, for which he prepares for many weeks. Joe reads the Torah portion called Vayigash. In some ways, it's really his story. The biblical Joseph has a confrontation with his brothers, whom he really hasn't seen in many years. They do not recognize him, in part because he's become the viceroy of Egypt, second in authority only to Pharaoh. At this moment of confrontation and revelation, Joseph says to his brothers, "I am Joseph." But it is a statement of disclosure both to himself and his brothers, who had failed to see who he really was. Now both he and his brothers see him for who he really is, not an assimilated Egyptian, second in command, but as a member of the Hebrew tribe, just a few generations before the giving of the Torah. So too our Joseph, who was ready to recognize his own Jewish soul, the soul that had been transmitted to him from Saul and Anna and the hundreds of generations that preceded him. Now he could say to himself and the community, "I am Joseph." Well, so the last chapter is a little tribute to Pardes, which I think I do owe them. Let me find I've studied at the Pardes for 3 summers. It's a week-long program. It's a wonderful program. And people always ask me when I do these talks, well, what about you? Why aren't you in the end of the book? In part because I didn't start out to write about me. I started to write out about Saul and Anna. But here's what I discovered in writing the book. I made a list of what I can now embrace and what continues to elude me. That is, I've made a list about my own potentially partially successful and partially failed reclamation. I can and I do embrace the love of Jewish learning. I suspect most of you do. You know, a scholar once said to me, it's important to touch Torah every day. And I've come to love Torah as a fabulous narrative that contains the best wisdom of life. I've come to see the history of the Jewish people as an eternal struggle for justice. We are a people who cannot be extinguished because it's really our ideals that saves the world from a barbaric grab for meaningless power. I've come to see that our daily life is enriched if each day you think a little bit about Torah. I have a love and reverence of the Jewish people, and I believe that we are the nation that was meant to bring a sense of justice and charity to the world. And I believe this, we were all at Sinai in one sense, and that we do have a covenant with God, and that we are in fact glued to the covenant. And much of that journey I learned at the Pardes Institute, where I studied for 3 summers. And I do urge you, if you have a mind, to go online and listen to their podcasts and look at their programs. They're really fabulous. But here's what I was not successful in doing, but I still fail at. I'm really not much more observant. I grew up in the suburbs, and soccer and baseball and football were part of my life. I work on Shabbat, although I try to attend Shabbat attend shul every Shabbat. I find it hard to use the word God in spoken life, although I talk to myself with it every day and use it often. I've been unable to master Hebrew, although I've studied it weekly for years. I can't really keep kosher, but I won't go near shrimp or pork. And each day when I pass through the portals of my home and my office, I look at them as Uzzah, and I try to remind myself to stay in contact with Torah, to embrace it whenever I'm able. I realize now that my own journey is because of the fragmented legacy of Joe and Saul. No matter how inartful and incomplete, they left me with a firm conviction that a Jew belongs to the world and that we must be a force for good in the world. And because of that, I'm grateful that despite the journey and the casting off, they left me with this wonderful Jewish legacy that maybe I can continue in some small way. So this is what I think it means in my own life to try to touch Torah every day. And that is my talk. Thank you all for being patient and listening. I hope I didn't go too far over my, I'm going to end my screen share.
I think it was absolutely perfect. I do want to say that, and we're getting claps. You should read some of the comments in the chat. You are preaching to the choir. The people who are here have made a community commitment to Makom Salah Lakeside. My Torah study people are here. Now, if you're not a member, I'm putting in the chat, you can always make a donation. So if you're not if you haven't made that community commitment yet. So, and I think many of the things you said today struck a nerve. People were talking about, having to say the Lord's Prayer. And I don't think I had to say it, but, and I grew up in Crystal Lake and there weren't any other Jewish kids in my school, but you were part of the Gentile society. So, and somebody has to come in and Alan Green, his wife, her mother put a stop to it. Also, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that Rabbi Golinkin, we have used his study materials. It's learning Hebrew in one day while standing on one foot. And I appreciate your struggles with learning Hebrew and thinking about Torah. It's not easy. And I think that you just have to keep studying and studying. Pardes is amazing. I will put the website in the chat as well for people to take a look at it. And yeah, let's see if it's right here. And I will get that. Let's go for some questions. We have a couple more minutes. We were talking before everybody got on that what's happening in the Ukraine now is not unlike what happened a little over 100 years ago. Jews are fleeing. We are trying to send help there. And in your Makom at Home, there's a couple of organizations that we encourage you if you want to donate, including the World Union for Progressive Judaism and the Joint Distribution Committee. However, Ukraine was never known as welcoming the Jews. It was pretty anti-Semitic, and now they have a Jewish president, and that is something absolutely remarkable to see. Anyone else? David, your definition of observance feels to be rooted in the study of text. What about social justice?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Actually, both. So the Vanessa mentioned that I did a program at Georgetown called The Moral Economy, and I teach bankruptcy law. My students don't know this, but I slip in a little Torah because I think that economic justice is built into Torah, and bankruptcy law at its highest level is really about economic justice and concern for those who fail, both at the individual level and at the corporate level. And so I did this. I volunteered to do this program because I wanted people to understand the joinder, and I asked rabbis to talk about Jewish notions of economic justice. And I think they are deeply, in fact, the reason I love the study of law, and I think the other thing my parents gave me was a passion for justice. And the fact that Jewish law and American law, they're struggling for the same end. And it's made me feel that my life's work really is about Torah in many ways. And I think Torah exemplifies what I'm trying to achieve. I now do amicus briefs for free at the Supreme Court. I've been doing that for the past 7 years, and I do it for people who can't afford, but for whom, the need for economic justice is critical. I'm actually involved in the Purdue bankruptcy case. You probably heard about a little bit about that. And although it's been settled, I've got my class and I have been very much working on trying to help those who are among the victims. So I think the justice is exactly what Judaism is all about. Exactly.
That question was from Ross Erlbacher, our president, and I especially like the part in your story where, was it your dad or your grandfather became president of the congregation? We need people to take leadership positions, and whether their wife dragged them there or not. And I see Zoom user. Is that Marilyn? Has their hand up.
Yes, that's me.
Okay, go ahead, Marilyn.
Yes, I so enjoyed all of the information you shared, but the way you shared it and the way you told the story, I was hanging on edge for the next word. It's beautifully shared. And I feel very fortunate that I was here this morning to hear you, and I will remember this story and hopefully do something about it as well, or try as a grandparent. But what I wanted to ask you was the statistics that you quoted. With us as Jews being a minority, how was that considered in those studies?
I'm not sure exactly how that would change anything, or I'm not sure I understand the thrust of the question, but there was a lot of comparison, between how we stack up compared to non-Jews and how we stack up compared to the Orthodox. But so where are you headed with that question, if I may ask?
Yes, there was one statistic that, and I can't remember exactly which one it was, but there was a percentage that you quoted.
Right. You're right. That Judaism is important to 20% of Jews, but it's very important to 40% of non-Jews.
And since we're a minority, how does that play into that?
I don't think it gives us any grace. I mean, it seems to me, no matter how small we are, in fact, a statistician could argue the smaller the group, the larger the percentage of observers should be. The fact that 40% of a much larger majority participates in Christian observance is actually harder to achieve than 20% of a smaller number.
Interesting.
So I would argue, statistically speaking, it may actually slightly make our outcome less good. It's not a good number. And I don't know what we're going to, one thing I learned in doing this talk, and I'll leave you with a little saying. I used to start a lot of my writings with a saying from a guy named Daniel Bornstein, who was head of the Smithsonian, who said, "I don't know what I think until I write it." And I said, I've learned there's a corollary, which is I don't know what I wrote until I talk about it. And it's not until I try to answer these questions and people say, well, what does it all mean? Which is, the impossible to answer question. I do think this. So we have the body count from Pew, and we have Dara saying how others feel about us. And I wanted to give people some insight into some of the possible causes. I do think, we push away from Torah. I tell you what goes on in my synagogue. When they need to cut the service down, they always cut out another reading from Torah. Maybe we don't need the Haftorah this week. Maybe we just need to have 3 Aliyahs. And the rabbi talks about, the environment instead of the parsha. So I do believe if I was to be totally authentic to what I believe most deeply, I think we've got to somehow refocus on the beauty and joy of studying the Torah, no matter how observant we become. We might still play soccer on Passover, but it doesn't mean that the brilliant stories in the Torah won't reverberate and help us, guide our behavior, our conduct. We won't see ourselves as the people who are repairing the world. We won't believe in that. So I think you can have literacy, that they're not the same thing as observance. And it doesn't even speak to assimilation necessarily. So I was trying to put a little different understanding about maybe what we need to be thinking about as we educate ourselves and our children.
I can only say here to that. I have also put in the chat David's website and encourage you to go get his book. Margaret Burka, one of our librarians, is on. And Margaret, if we don't already have this book in our library, I hope that there she is. I hope we'll get it very soon. And actually the statistic that threw me off and that I'm going to remember is that more people believe in aliens. And, that just kind of, that's what we're dealing with in 2021.
We are. If you were to take a poll of how many people believe the earth is flat, you'd get 15%. So that's what we are. That's the era we live in.
Yes, that's the most frightening to me. I can only thank you enough. Please, everyone is thanking you in the chat. I hope you see that, David.
I do. Thank you.
Special thanks to Susie Silver, who recommended you to come on down to Macomb Sola Lakeside. We hope that if you come back to Chicago, we can welcome you back in person. And we look forward to, we'll have a few in-person things even later on in the spring. Watch your Macomb at Home for all of those announcements. It's great to see everyone. Be well.
All right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.